Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So what we're discussing today is pollution, climate change, and growth. And these are usually in other conferences, 3 different sessions. And I'd actually like to compliment IGC for having it as one session so that we can think about the 3 things in a holistic manner. So before we start, I'm going to do a quick introduction of the very, very eminent panelists that I have on this session today. So first, Professor Nicholas Stern. He is the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government and Chairman of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment and Head of the India Observatory at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is also the Senior Advisor to IGC, and he has held academic appointments at Oxford, Warwick, and LSE, and also at MIT, École Polytechnique, and Collège de France in Paris, as well as at the Indian Statistical Institute in Bangalore and Delhi, and the People's University of China in Beijing. So anything you want to know, actually, he will have all the answers. And then Dr. Greenstone. Michael Greenstone is the Milton Friedman Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. He is also a research program director for IGC's Energy Research Program. And will talk to us today specifically about the research that he's been doing on air pollution and emissions from industry and industrial plants, right? Great. And Ulka Kelkar. Ulka is the climate director at the World Resources Institute, and she coordinates the team's climate policy work and supports India's pathway to a low carbon economy. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us, as well as all of you in the audience for taking the time to join this very interesting conversation. We're going to try and keep it very interactive. So just to set the context before we start, I'd like to talk about the 3 things that we're discussing today and how we think about them individually, but how I'd like for, in this panel, for us to think about them in an integrated manner. So we're almost at the end of summer, finally, so most of us in Delhi are quite happy about that. But very soon we're going to be quite displeased with the onset of the smog, right? And so Delhi's otherwise delightful winter is going to be marred very soon. And this is actually not just a phenomena that plagues Delhi, even though we talk about it most in the context of the capital region. But 10 of the most polluted cities in the world are in northern India, and air pollution is now in India the 3rd largest cause of death. And by recent estimates, in 2017, 1.24 million people died of air pollution. So we can no longer think about it as an irritant, but really as a much more compelling and urgent issue that needs resolution. But also not to think about it in isolation of itself. The climate change conversation in India has been going on for far longer. In many ways, India has displayed a lot of climate leadership, especially in the context of deploying very large amounts of renewable energy and having very ambitious targets. But how do we think about climate change beyond electricity? How do you think about industrial decarbonization? How do you think about taking the climate action agenda to the communities? And we'll hear a little bit about that from Ulka. And then to think about growth, right? We're actually at a very interesting time in India's economy because there's one very strong narrative around India growing to become a $5 trillion economy. And there's, of course, some thinking by at least specific groups about how do you do that in a low carbon way, how do you think about strategic industries to power this growth. But on the other hand, every single day the newspapers are full of stories of industries slowing down, of lots of joblessness, of micro, small and medium scale enterprises that feed into the value chains of large industry coming under huge stress. And how do you then square these 2 narratives? But more importantly, in context of today's discussion, how do you interconnect these 3 very important issues? So with that context, I'd like to start the discussion, and maybe we'll open with you, Professor Stern. And maybe just to hear opening comments about what do you really think are the drivers for climate action in the Indian context? And if you think that they're sufficient to address actually the entire range from air pollution, which is thought of as a localized issue, to growth at the entire macroeconomic level.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having us, and it's a great pleasure to participate in the celebration of 10 years of the IGC, and as a result of my age, I seem to have been present before the birth of many things, but I was certainly a participant in the birth, and it's wonderful to see what it's become, and very good to be back here in India. As you know, I've been working here now for more than 45 years, with a particular perspective from one village in Moradabad district of UP, which we've been working on throughout that time, and we've got data going back to the 1950s, so we've got one full study, no sampling, of the village for every decade since independence, and it very much influences the way in which I understand Indian growth and change. Now, the drivers of climate action in India, first it's understanding the problem, and second it's understanding what you can do. Yeah? Well, India is enormously vulnerable to climate change. If you look at the glaciers and snows on the Himalayas, that's where the big rivers for North India, and indeed for Asia, rise. And if you go round clockwise all the way through, I mean, you've got the Yellow River and the Yangtze and the Mekong, and then the Ganges and the Jamuna, and all the way around to the Indus. And of course, India is a big part of that flow. They're sponges that hold the water, and if those sponges reduce, then you get major flooding, landslides, soil erosion, destruction of the infrastructure, huge loss of life. When the rains are intense and they're not held there, and you get droughts in the rainy season. Now, the village of Palanpur is on the Indo-Gangetic Plain, and it depends enormously on the water level under that plain. Well, if the snows and glaciers go, then that water level will drop, because everything will shoot out down into the Bay of Bengal, and you lose the water and the groundwater and that under the Indo-Gangetic Plain. The agriculture in North India, particularly obviously Palanpur as part of that story, depends on the monsoon. We don't know how the monsoon will change. We can say that it could change very abruptly, but we don't know how. But it's a major uncertainty. We'll probably learn more, but that's the second part of the story. We know that coastal India is very vulnerable to cyclones, whichever side, west or east, very vulnerable to cyclones, and they will get more severe. Desertification in other parts of India will be a problem. And, most of climate change isn't so much about the temperature, it's about water, and all the examples I've given are about water. But the temperature will matter too. And there'll be some parts of northern India where the wet bulb temperature, which is a combination of temperature and humidity, will get above 35 degrees. If that happens, and emphasize, we know that temperature is often above 35 degrees, it's the wet bulb temperature, it's the combination of the temperature and humidity. If that happens, you can't be outside for more than a few hours without dying. I mean, it takes you right off. So those are 5 reasons to worry deeply. Yeah? And they're about lives and livelihoods. And some parts of India, many of which would be very heavily populated, would probably be uninhabitable. So what happens? Well, the people who can't move, many of them get killed or they die. And the people who can move. It's called adaptation, but it's a very drastic form of adaptation. But what happens? They go somewhere. Well, if we look at world history, big migrations can cause very serious conflict, and the reason for that conflict can't be turned off. Now, like many of you see population movements on a big scale. I mean, I've worked a bit I've worked in North India, South India, and Northeast India. You know, Assam would see increased movement of population from Bangladesh. Well, we all know that political situation is already fairly incendiary, but that's in the words of Ronnie Reagan, you ain't seen nothing yet. And we've got 1 degree, you know, roughly speaking, but we're headed for 3-4 degrees, perhaps more, unless, of course, we change very quickly. So that's the motivation for changing very quickly. Now, why, and remember how quickly we have to change, because for 2 degrees centigrade, I mean, we should be aiming for 1.5, but for 2 degrees, if you look at the IPCC report of October last year, which focused on the difference between 1.5 and 2, which is major. But suppose you just think about 2, not even the well below 2, which was agreed in Paris. Over the next 20 years, the world has to cut its emissions by about 40% or more, just for 2 degrees. And with a growth rate of 3% or so, that output would roughly double. So in 20 years, you have to cut emissions per unit of output as a world by 80%. So that's a measure of how fast you have to change. If you want to stabilize at 1.5, you have to go to net zero by roughly 2050. Obviously, to stabilize concentrations, you have to be net zero. So even if, God forbid, we stabilize concentrations at 4 degrees, corresponding to 4 degrees, you still have to be net zero. So the earlier you go to net zero, the lower the temperature at which you stabilize. But if you look at just 1.5 or 2 degrees, you're talking about net zero 2050 or 2070. Net zero, that means net zero, right? When we talked about cutting by 80% by 2050, everybody thought they were in the 20%. But net zero is net zero. It means you have to do it virtually everywhere. There'll be some negatives in that, but, you know, not that much. So this is why the consequences show why you cut, and then the second point I've made is how fast you have to cut, and then the third thing is, so what you know, as we say in India, what to do, and there are many versions of what to do, right? But this is a purposive what to do. It's not a what to do, nothing you can do. It's a purposive what to do. So you have to cut back right across the spectrum: energy and transport and buildings and land use. You have to go, roughly speaking, to zero across the board. Now, the good news is that we can see how to do that, or at least we can see how to begin well in doing that. You know, we know that we can have zero carbon power. We can see how to do that. We probably need zero carbon power around the world by roughly 2040, because that's going to be so important in the other parts. So that's one part of the story. The heating story is going to have to look very different. The cooling story, you know, the air conditioning and so on, is going to have to look very different. But we can see in each case, and it's a combination, so too with industry, and it's a combination of reducing demand for those kinds of things by better pricing, better planning, better insulated buildings and so on. It's about cutting back on energy, and it's about energy efficiency, and it's about different kinds of sources. And wherever you look, it's some combination of these kinds of things. And we can see how to do it virtually everywhere. And I would recommend looking at publication of last October by the Energy Transition Commission called Mission Possible, which deliberately looked at the difficult stuff. The difficult stuff being air transport, sea transport, cements, steel, and so on. And there are ways forward right across the board in which efficiency is very important. So India has a chance, because it's late, and of course infrastructure central to all this. India's late in the day in building its infrastructure. That turns out to be an advantage because you can build much cleaner. India's late in the day at urbanisation. That's also an advantage, one which India has not yet taken. But that would be extremely important. And India could create cities where you can move and breathe and be productive. Certainly beats what we have at the moment. So everywhere you look, we can see ways forward which are actually extremely attractive, and they include ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. So start with the consequences, look at how fast you have to change and where you have to change, and then look at where you can change. And you end up with a very positive story. This is a story of growth. It's a story of growth which combine, particularly through investment in sustainable infrastructure, which boosts demand in a demand-constrained world, and actually at the moment a demand-constrained country. It sharpens supply. It unleashes over the medium term a Schumpeterian story of innovation, discovery, investment and growth. And there is no high-carbon, long-run growth story. It's not there because it self-destructs on the hostile environment. So this is actually the growth story.
So maybe just to ask you a quick follow-on question. You've clearly mentioned the need for a lot of these parallel transitions in each sector.
They're supportive. They're mutually supportive. Parallel is not the right word, but
right.
Simultaneous.
Sure, simultaneous, right? So, but what is your recommendation for financing this? Where is the money going to come from?
Well, this is about a different form of investment. If you look at the numbers that we did when we produced Better Growth, Better Climate, I'm co-chair of the Global Commission on Economy and Climate, and 5 years ago we looked at some of the story around what was involved in the infrastructure investment, and most of it is about doing things differently, but there will be some extra. But we must be very careful not to suppose that all this is new infrastructure investment. All this is the infrastructure investment that you do should take a different form. But it will take a bit more. Well, where does investment come from? Anyway, it comes from savings. I mean, that's the basic macroeconomic story that economics offers to the world. And what we have at the moment is a world that is full of saving. We have investment opportunities that are really striking. But what we can't do necessarily is turn the investment opportunities into real investment projects. That depends on good policy. It depends on a good infrastructure plan. It depends on the right kind of pricing. So good policy will pull through those investments. And then what you want is the right kind of finance available in the right place at the right time. So I prefer to do it as a kind of matching problem. How do you pull the investments through? How do you get the right kind of finance available at the right time? Rather than necessarily, this is a huge increase. It is an increase in investment. It is, but it's still more importantly, it's a radical change in the way in which we do all the investment.
Can I just follow one thing I'm not quite following? Are you saying, I think I heard it embedded in there, everything you're saying is true conditional on carbon pricing, or is it not?
No, it's conditional on policy. And there's much more to all this than carbon pricing. Carbon pricing has an important part of the story. But we should announce now that, as India has done, that internal combustion engine sales are out after a given date. In the UK, it's 2040. We'll push very hard to bring that forward. So that's an example of a policy. We should be banning the internal combustion engine vehicles in our city centres after a certain date, call it 2025. There are big policy stories here that look at the way Europe got rid of the incandescent light bulb. It just said no incandescent light bulb. And the whole LED story came through very fast, and India's been a very big part of that story in driving down the price of LEDs. So a lot of this will be standards and design, and a lot of it will be pricing. A lot of it will be getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies and fertilizer subsidies. So there's a whole range of policy things. And I do react, I know you're from Chicago, Mike, but it's not just one price fixes it all, you know. But having said that, I'm strongly in favor of strong carbon pricing.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really good segue also to move to you, Dr. Greenstone, to talk about, is a stick approach to industrial emissions enough? Or do you need to balance a carrot and stick? And based on the research that you've been doing, if you want to talk about that, I know you have some slides if you want to present them now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll try to do that. So let's see if I can make this fit into discussion. So actually, I think I misread the email about what the panel was going to be about. I thought it was all about climate change. And so I was prepared to say, well, that's completely wrong. You shouldn't look at only climate change, you should look at growth, and you should look at pollution as well. But here I find myself, and that's how you structured the whole panel. So let me give my remarks that I'll try to fit them. I think they actually fit in better than I expected them to. And so let me try to talk about it. So this picture actually, I think, helps encapsulate what I think. I don't think we have a climate change challenge. I actually think we have a global energy challenge, of which climate change is an important part of it. But I think we will make choices that ultimately undermine our well-being if we think of it only as a climate problem, which I took as a framing of this panel. So in many respects, I think this picture encapsulates what I think of as the climate, as a global energy challenge. And I see that as a stool that has three legs. The first leg of the stool is how do we get access to reliable and inexpensive sources of energy. And in this picture, you can see those reliable and inexpensive sources of energy are allowing people not to walk, they're driving, they're on motor scooters. It's produced a lot of the economic growth that India has benefited from in the last couple decades. And so I view that as kind of a pillar. That's all societies are going to have that first and foremost in their mind. But there are two other pillars that I think are also important to have in their mind. They're also depicted in the picture. The way we currently construct energy markets, which relates to my question to Nick, is that pushes us to use fossil fuels because it doesn't account for what economists like to call externalities, or the pollution or the CO2 that's involved with the combustion of fossil fuels. And those are also evident in this picture. You can see it's the middle of the day and it looks like night. The guys in the picture are very, very aware that the air pollution that is a result of the same fossil fuels that's powered this economic growth are causing health problems. They're trying to protect themselves. And that's the second leg of the stool. And the third leg of the stool is not visible, but you know it's there, which is that the same fossil fuels that have powered this economic growth and have produced this air pollution are also involved in the release of CO2, and that's increasing the odds of disruptive climate change. And so what I see as kind of the central issue here is how different societies can find ways to navigate between those different goals. And I think different societies are going to end up making different choices based on their income level, based on their values, based on politics, based on a series of things, but that there is not a single goal, and I suspect Nick might not agree with me, but I think there's this balancing act that societies have to do. So just with respect to just illustrate the three goals, with respect to the goal one, which is how do societies get access to reliable and inexpensive energy, which is critical for growth. Here's just projections of India's energy. I think this is all energy consumption. And you can see that the way energy markets are constructed, it remains on target for very heavy reliance on fossil fuels. And this is out to 2040. It's also true that there's projected to be lots and lots of growth of consumption. The second goal is how to manage local environmental concerns. And here I've taken a map from something I've created called the Air Quality Life Index with my colleagues at the Energy Policy Institute. And this is just using global satellite data, and it's reporting PM 2.5 concentrations around the planet. And you can see, and these are not entirely, but primarily due to the combustion of fossil fuels. You can see that it is not all parts of the world, but many parts of the world are contending with particulates air pollution. The northern belt of India and northern part of China especially stand out, but it's also true in sub-Saharan Africa, and you can even see it in my hometown of Chicago as well. Now, what do those fossil fuels do or what does that air pollution do for people's health? Well, here we're going to zoom in. First, we'll zoom in on India, just still continuing to look at particulate matter. And here the data is available at the district level, so you have pretty detailed data. And you can see that there's parts of India that had very, very high concentrations of PM2.5, not just during the winter and not just when Punjab is burning crops, but this is an average over the entire year. And I guess the average in India is about 54 micrograms per cubic meter. The WHO standard is 10. So the next graph will show you, well, what would be the gains in life expectancy, how they would be distributed around India if each region was brought in compliance with WHO standards. And what you can see is that the average person in India would live about 4 years longer than they currently do if air pollution were brought into compliance with WHO standards. You can see the effects are not equal across India. Obviously the northern belt, which is more heavily polluted, the losses of life expectancy are larger than the average. Okay, so that's the second goal. How do you try and manage that problem, and how do you try to manage it? The third goal is, how do you mitigate the probability of disruptive climate change, which Nick, as always, did a beautiful job articulating what climate change could look like. And here I'll do much less beautiful, but maybe I'm more comfortable by doing it with some graphs. I think this helps illustrate where we are. So this is the distribution of daily mean temperatures for the typical person in India currently, 2020. And so the mean day is about 26 degrees C. That's the daily average. It's not the high, it's the average of the high and low. The median is about 27, so the typical person in India gets about 40 days a year where it's about 27. And then I'm just gonna draw your attention to days that are greater than 32, where we think a lot of the temperature-related problems live. That's where crops start to have great difficulty. That's where the human body starts to have great difficulty, elevated mortality rates. That's where people really start to rely on cooling technologies, so energy consumption goes up. And there's about 35 days of that a year. So now we're just gonna zoom ahead to 2050, and you can see the distribution starts moving over to the right. The mean and the median don't change that much, but actually there's a big piling up on those hot days. So the number of hot days, say greater than 32, roughly doubles. And this is on a kind of business as usual scenario. It's not a all in on cutting CO2. This is kind of what we would face if we didn't have coordinated action. And then we can bump up ahead to 2100, and there's another doubling of those hot days. So now the typical person in India would be projected to face about almost 110 days per year where the average temperature is greater than 32, and you can see the mean and the median have also moved. But it's really the hot days that are the most important because that's where there's these very non-linear relationships between temperature and measures of well-being. And so now I'm just going to preview some new research of mine where we globally look at the excess mortality risk that is projected to happen due to climate change. And here we do it in every single year. I'm just going to show you at the end of the century, and I'm going to zoom in just focus on India, although we have done this globally. And what's striking is that most parts of India are projected to have very large increases in mortality risk associated with climate change. You can also see that it's not distributed evenly around India. The effects is actually projected to be pretty small in Mumbai, reflecting its more temperate climate, starting climate. Delhi, which is already hot, is projected to have quite large increases in mortality rates. We can do this for any district here. I've also pulled out Chennai and Kolkata. So I want to just turn back to where I started. My view is that what India, what the United States, what China, what really all countries are trying to do is not just manage climate change, but to find a balancing act between these three goals, not all of which point in the same direction. So yes, it would be very easy to get rid of particulates, pollution, and CO2 pollution. We all know how to do that. Unfortunately, that would likely come at the expense of growth, and the kind of growth that is so important, especially in countries that have lower income levels to begin with. And I think I look forward to digesting and dissecting this a little bit on the panel, but ultimately societies are going to be making these judgments on how to trade these three goals off based on a variety of factors, including many that are specific to their own context. And then as a teaser, I'll just say, I do think that there is a solution, or a path, I don't want to say a solution, a path for India that's right in front of us, which is the need to focus on particulates, which is killing people today, I think can also be quite consonant with having some climate benefits and today, but as a side, and in principle could be done without greatly increasing costs of energy. So there, thank you.
So maybe before moving to Ulka, I have a follow-on question for you, which is, while all the data and monitoring shows us a bleak picture and should be enough to scare us into action, and you said that you see a path ahead, what is your recommendation around enforcement and implementation of the path? Because one of the things that we find most challenging in India, despite all the good intentions and policies and regulations, is the implementation of these things.
Yeah, so I think implementation, implementation I think is actually a function of political will. Mm-hmm. I think if you think back to not very long ago, say 2013, the idea that China would be like a laser focused on reducing particulates air pollution seemed absurd, completely unimaginable. And then something happened. I'm not a political scientist, but the politics shifted. And India is a vibrant democracy. China does not run on exactly the same political system. And yet you had a government that was very responsive once the people started to demand it. And so my view on how to make progress on these issues is that their consequences of the pollution or maybe the climate change need to be better communicated, and then when people demand it, government will respond. And so now I'll just end with a little plug. Tomorrow, the state of Gujarat is launching the world's first cap and trade program for particulates air pollution, which I've helped provide advice on.
Good, very good. I think that's a really interesting point to turn to you, Ulka, because you understand the political economy quite well, I would say. And I think that a lot of the climate action that has put us, I would say, at least at the head table internationally, has been very supply side driven, right? So it's large renewable energy projects, public procurement. But how do you take the transition story to the communities? And how do we generate demand for climate action or action even on say, localized issues like pollution, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Kanika. There have been a lot of examples from energy in this session, the whole day, in fact. But just across town, there is another COP happening on the UNCCD. So I thought I'd give an example from land use. My colleagues at WRI India have done a study, something called an India Restoration Atlas, and they find that India has 180 million hectares of restoration potential, not just protecting forests, but also doing agroforestry on rain-fed cultivated areas. And this can contribute to a significant extent, 3.5 to 4 billion tons of carbon, towards India's third NDC goal, which is not an energy economy goal, but a carbon sink target. The micro picture of this is that we did field work in one district in Madhya Pradesh, in Siddhi district, talk to all the relevant stakeholders, the communities. And we find that if it is done right, if the right trees are planted in the right places with the support of the local communities, then just in one district you can generate wage income opportunities of $10 million. So the sort of unexpected kind of insight that comes from a more macro picture, sort of the evidence around the way forest restoration, forest protection happens around the world, is that actually the lowest cost way of carbon mitigation is by giving land titles to indigenous communities. Because they find that in forests which are protected by indigenous communities, rather than those where human activity is utterly forbidden, there is the deforestation rate is 2 to 3 times lower. So there is actually a case to be made for working with communities rather than trying to keep them out. The second example I want to give is actually from large-scale solar. And there's a lot. I think CEEW has done a study on the jobs from renewable energy. I think something like 3.3 lakh jobs over 5 years. But if you look at the kind of workforce, the rate at which it's growing, it's something like 5 lakh people entering the workforce every year. There's a lot of anecdotal journalistic evidence now coming out of the large solar parks in Charanka and Paugada. And if you see the way these solar parks are being rolled out, farmers are leasing out their land, and the landless laborers or the pastoral communities who are dependent on this land for their livelihoods are now kind of being kept out. Now, you might want to present this as a trade-off, but you might also want to look at it as a recommendation. You have state and national skill development missions. And they are offering training programs for green jobs, for alternative green jobs. But is the training accessible, particularly to women? The nature of the jobs is contractual in nature. You want to set up enterprises, small enterprises, they should be able to have access to finance. So a lot of these different pieces need to come together in order for the demand side or the local sort of angle of this climate story to work out.
Yeah. And I think that, of course, it's the job of institutions like us to generate the evidence and show the mirror in that sense. But how do you, what is your recommendation for overcoming the gap in ambition between different states and between different sub-sovereign entities, really? Because so much of the implementation and how these large policy commitments, etc., how they get rolled out is a function of, as Michael said, the political will. And because the political will needs to exist at so many levels, is evidence enough, and what more can we do?
Right. So I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. There's, if you could do a search for ambition loop, there are several case studies available of how action by non-state, subnational actors is driving greater ambition by national governments. And for example, in India, we have done a study where, with CII, which looks at just the 50 largest companies. And if you see the action that they've taken voluntarily, this can dip the emissions trajectory of India by 1 to 2% by 2030. So this is just 50 companies alone, without anything forcing them to do this. I want to slightly digress because since yesterday I've been listening to the conversations, and there's it's called Evidence for Inclusive Growth, and I wanted to give examples from 2 studies which have nothing to do with climate change. And one of them relates to microfinance and self-help groups, and this is a 2013 study by Panellists et al. And they look at what happens when women join self-help groups. And of course, their household income goes up, their bargaining power within the household goes up. But when the husbands join the same self-help group, the women's bargaining power within the household actually diminishes. The second story that I wanted to talk about was from a couple of, I think Diane Coffey has an article. These were the 2 surveys that were done. One was a social attitudes research survey. And they asked a very simple question to households in Uttar Pradesh. They said, do women eat after the men in your family? And they looked at these 2 different surveys, and they found that in one survey, they got slightly different results between the 2. And they wondered why. And in just trying to explain this very small kind of glitch almost it seemed between these 2 surveys, they found that one of the surveys asked only women, and in another survey they asked both men and women. And this is the statement, I wanted to read it out. And they say that where discrimination is severe, it is often easier to get people to admit to engaging in acts of discrimination than to experiencing it. And I thought that was quite devastating. So when you asked me about taking it down to the communities and the demand side, and we have talked about behavioral change today, but this is social change, this is fundamental change in social norms, and as one of the panelists earlier said, this is difficult. But I wanted to end with just one more quotation. There's this article by Jonathan Franzen that is doing the rounds on Twitter. The climate scientists are all very upset about it because it seems to say that there's no hope. We might as well admit that we've lost the battle with climate change. There's one sentence that actually made sense. It says, in times of increasing chaos, people seek protection in tribalism and armed force rather than in the rule of law. And our best defense against this kind of dystopia is to maintain functioning democracies, functioning legal systems, functioning communities. And so maybe the climate change answer lies in larger institutional and social change.
I think that's a very profound note to open this discussion up for some questions. And I'd like, we'll take questions in groups of 3, so please raise your hand and we'll recognize you. If you can keep your question short and keep in mind the integrated nature of the discussion that we've been having when you're asking your question. If there aren't any and all your questions have been answered, okay. I thought I could ask more, but we have some questions, one here and one here.
I think I'll go.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a research fellow at CEEW. Michael, you mentioned the cap and trade program, and from my understanding, you guys have been running a pilot program in Gujarat so far. Could you just talk about the results and what are your key findings from that program so far?
Yeah, so...
Wait, we'll just collect a few, just in the interest of time.
Yeah.
Can I get the mic?
Yep. Yes, it's right there.
Yeah, my name is JP Bajoria. Want to ask, want to ask everybody, in fact, there are some pollutants which we know before it was manufactured. When plastic came in power, it was basically circulated all over the world. Probably, I don't think there cannot be anybody who knows about that it will cause a major hurdle for the pollution purpose. But then it was circulated everywhere. Now we are trying to make that, go out of that. Similarly, there is something like chemical fertilizer.
Understood.
So chemical fertilizer also called the pollutant. Now we are trying to make them out of manufacturing.
Right.
So why can't we think before then implementing all those things?
Got it. Thanks. So I think this question in the back, but maybe we'll start with these two. Do you want to talk about the cap and trade pilot?
Sure. So the cap and trade pilot has been going on for a couple of years. The first and most important part was to get reliable SEMS readings. So SEMS are continuous emissions monitoring systems that read the particulates that come out of the stack. And that's critical if you're going to have trading. You have to have an accurate measurement of what's coming out of the stack. And then for the last 2 months, we have had an actual trading going on. But it's been with fake money. And that was useful in kind of stress testing the system and seeing where there might be some holes, and we've done a little fixing up. And then on September 16th, it'll be announced tomorrow, but on September 16th, live trading will begin with money, and the 165 industries are all used to doing trades now, and there'll be weekly auctions and high availability of the data. So I'm optimistic, but I should emphasize that we have set up a treatment group of the 165 who are entering the market, and 165 who will continue to be regulated in the status quo way, and that will give us a chance to determine the impacts.
Professor Stern, I'd like to maybe slightly paraphrase the second question, and not so much about, why did we do this in the past? I mean, what's done is done, we just have to fix it now. But how do you prevent from new, I mean, for instance, with the Montreal Protocol, that's a good example of how with the refrigerants, the problem sort of got worse before it's now going to get better. How do we prevent from these kinds of missteps, so to speak, given that there isn't really, we don't have the luxury of time to experiment so much?
One way is to try to learn more quickly from mistakes, and the kind of techniques that Mike and his colleagues have been, and the IGC have been pioneering, I think are in that example. Try to understand what has happened and to try to understand much more quickly. I mean, I think on the subject of fertilizers, we should have understood much more quickly the damage that fertilizers were doing. You know, they pollute the water and they destroy the topsoil. I live in an English village and watch the agriculture, and I work in an Indian village and watch the agriculture. And we've been soil mining. You know, you throw urea on, you get a quick result, and you forget about the other stuff, and you destroy. And I think what we have to do now is to try to learn much more quickly from those things. And we can do it, I think, because we've got better statistical research techniques, but also I think we've got a better understanding of the kinds of things that can go wrong. The second one is, and I think what you were there's plastics also, but I'm talking about method. The second method is to try to anticipate beforehand the kinds of things that can go wrong.
Right.
And the medics do that when they do trials of medicines, and they ask the question, does this medicine, is it effective in tackling this problem, and is it causing other problems? And so I think in some parts of this we have to do that too. But let me underline that we're in a real hurry. Yeah? And you know, you say to people, look, you've got a world economy will double in 20 years or so. You've got to cut emissions around the world by 40% in those 20 years, just for 2 degrees, much more for well below 2 degrees, and much, much more for 1.5. And they say, well, there are only 2 numbers in that, right? I mean, 2 and 40%. And it's crystal clear. The first one is arithmetic, and the second one is the science. And that is a real hurry.
Yeah.
And then they go on as if you said nothing at all.
Yeah.
By 2030, India will probably, emissions will probably overtake China's.
Yeah.
Yeah? India's probably still on the way up, will hit China already on the way down. And if India doesn't hit net zero within 30 or 40 years, the world will not hit net zero.
Yeah.
I mean, make it 50 if you want to go to 2070, and that's a danger, that's 2 degrees and dangerous. But you know, unless India peaks around or before 2030, you'll be in real trouble. Now, Mike gave you a graph. I didn't look anything like peaking anytime soon. So as we think about wise anticipation of things that can go wrong, which we must, we also have to recognize how fast we have to change. And there's some things that look right now, like designing cities where you can move and breathe by keeping out the internal combustion engine, making it much easier to use bicycles and to walk, having electric vehicles which are also controlled by an Internet of Things. All those things I think you can see are very likely to produce good results without necessarily testing and trialing and trying, because city design, yeah? I mean, Mike is a great economist and he can test his emissions pollutant trading schemes quite quickly. City design, which India has to face now, and we've got the Smart Cities program, and good, but you know, the amount of experimentation you can do and change as fast as you need is hard.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to anticipate and think well and analyze well We might be able to model computationally, that you have digital twins and so on, so we have to get more intelligent at anticipating and modeling, because the pace at which we have to go and the scale at which we have to change will allow only a limited amount of the kind of experimental learning we'd love to do. And we should do it, but we're also going to have to analyze and anticipate.
Yeah.
I agree with much of that, and I agree about the urgency of time, and that we don't have time to run a bazillion experiments on this, as much as I would love to run a bazillion experiments.
I'd like you to run many experiments.
Yeah. But I see the central climate problem as, can societies, India certainly included, tackle the very, very challenging politics of pricing carbon. I think there's a lot of other things that are going to be helpful, but if you're not going to be serious about pricing carbon, I don't really think you're going to be serious about climate change.
But can we pick up on the political will story, because that's one thing on which we all agree, but of course then the question is analytically how you get it. And I've written and championed carbon pricing for a very long period of time, but what I don't delude myself into thinking is it's the only single test of this story. Carbon pricing doesn't redesign cities. It can help.
That's for you
no,
and
wait.
I differ.
No.
That's where you and I differ.
If as you redesign cities.
No, people will see the price and the city will look different.
No, that couldn't happen fast. I really don't think that can happen fast enough. But let's come back to the political world story.
I just want to draw and there's now suddenly a lot of questions, and we're at the end of time. So I'm going to encourage you all to use the break after this session to please ask your questions. But I want to just take this conversation, Ulka, to you also as sort of closing comments. There's a lot of things that need to be done, including pricing carbon, if not only pricing carbon. How do we get at home the thinking around all of these separate issues to become more integrated? Because at the moment, these are all conversations that are ongoing, but they're not interacting with each other.
So I'm going to try to respond to the points that the other two panelists made, as well as the issue that you raised. And it's not possible for all of us to carry out experiments, in real time, but we can simulate. And if you go to india.energypolicy.solutions, you can look at a systems dynamics model of the economy, and you can do a thought experiment. What if India were to peak its emissions by 2030? What would it take? And you'd find that carbon tax is indeed a very crucial part of that, for that to happen. But what that model also shows you, that there are some kind of options that are negative cost in the transport sector or in industrial energy efficiency. And then there are some which actually, if you look at the air quality impact of it, you would be saving 100,000 lives in the 10 years by doing what looks like climate policy. What the model will also show you, that if you implement a carbon tax, consumers' cash flow will go down, government's cash flow will go up, and there is a need for revenue recycling, either in terms of giving it back to households, as British Columbia has done, or as, for example, in northeastern United States, to invest it in research and development. So the carbon pricing is very much a part of it in terms of giving a signal, but the signal needs to be strong enough to actually spur innovation, and the communication around it has to be managed very well.
Okay, so before we close, I'm just going to come back on the political will question. Very short last comments, please, from each of the panelists. And very specifically, the importance of political will, I think, is well established, and I think we all agree on it in this room. And some would argue that the current government in India, also the subnational governments in several Indian states, recognize the problem and are trying to take actions, possibly in a siloed approach or on specific lower hanging fruit kind of areas.
Which problem?
All the three legs of the stool. Right. That being said, though, what is your one single recommendation for a lever that can really kickstart the pace?
Yeah. We're choosing here different ways of growing. Now, economics is about choice, but it's not always about trade-offs. Much of it's about trade-offs, but this is about choices of different kinds of growth paths. which will involve city design, very different approaches to energy, very different approaches to the circular economy and resource efficiency of various kinds. So if you have to change the whole economy, the whole idea that there's one single thing that you have to do is deeply misleading. There are a number of things which can be very powerful, and carbon pricing would be high up on most of our lists of what would be very powerful. But as I said, city design and standards are other parts of that story. But how do you get the political will to put any of that into practice? The first thing is people have to understand just how damaging the consequences are, both of climate change and of air pollution. It's quicker to do it on air pollution because it's more immediate and visible. But I think people are seeing the signs on climate. And the young people in particular are seeing that. Our kids who come to university now have been taught about climate change for 15 years. It's just obvious to them in a way that people 15 years older than them, it would not be obvious. So a big part of the political will is the young people. We're having an election in the UK in November. There will be a seeking after young people's votes, and part of that seeking after young people's votes will be climate. So people have to be worried, and that worriedness has to be based on understanding. The second part of the story, and what I tried to emphasize very strongly, is that the alternative models of growth that we're thinking about are just very attractive. They're efficient and they're clean and they're less congested and the ecosystems are more robust and fruitful. So that picture of what we can do has to be a big part of the story as well. And that is part because of how fast we have to move. It's got to come from description of what's possible. But increasingly we're seeing examples and powerful examples of what is possible, and they will be important too.
Yeah.
I'm going to interpret your question as one politically, that I can see a path to something politically feasible in India. Okay. Yeah. Cap and trade for particulates over the whole country. It's totally doable. It'll save lots and lots of lives. It will actually reduce the regulatory costs that industry currently faces. They're facing these command and control regulations, which are extraordinarily expensive, and unleashing the market to let them figure out inexpensive ways to do it will be good for them and good for air quality and good for people's lives.
Good. Okay.
I'm going to be a little cheeky and echo Professor Stern's comments. When the Stern Review came out, there was a lot of discussion about the discount rate. And very recently, I read a comment which said, when school children strike, you see Greta Thunberg and others, it is the discount rate personified. At what rate do you discount future benefits? In 2050, my daughter will be the age that I am now. And if that thinking doesn't drive political will, I don't know what else will.
Great, thank you very much. As I've been thinking about how do I close this session and the very rich and varied topics that we've discussed and ideas that we've discussed, I'd actually like to borrow from the three values that drive our work at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. So the three values are integrated, independent and international. And I actually think that is the framework with which I'd summarize our discussion today. Think about the problems in an integrated manner really as legs of a stool so that you don't topple over. Independent of do the research, follow the most rigorous methods, show the mirror to the action makers, but also don't be married to the outcome when you're doing the research, but also sort of think about the political economy and the political will that will drive the action. And internationally, we can't think about this as a local problem or a state problem or an India problem. This is really a global problem, and we have to learn from each other and we have to work together if we want to actually get even close to addressing the problem in full. So with that, I'd like to thank each of you very much for this very interesting discussion, and thank the audience for your attentiveness, and I apologize for not taking more questions, but we are ending on time, so you'll have a break to ask your questions. Thank you very much.